right, so we're starting in Amos this week. We're going to spend 6 weeks on the book of Amos. It has 9 chapters, so we will be doing a little more than a chapter a week on average, although we'll probably just do chapter 1 and 3 verses of chapter 2 today. I was thinking we'd go through chapter 1 and 2. If you read through Amos, you'll see chapters 1 and 2 form a cohesive unit. They definitely seem to be a sermon that was delivered all at one time on the same occasion. But because I'm adding the introductory material just to introduce Amos in general, I won't really have time to do justice to all the real stuff that Amos gets to in chapter 2 this week. So we'll cover the bulk of chapter 2 and maybe chapter 3 next week. We'll see how that goes. So I just want to jump in with verse 1 because as we have seen with Joel and Obadiah, verse 1 or part of verse 1 introduces the prophet and gives us a little bit of a orientation to him as much as we can. So in verse 1 of Amos, we read, "The words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, the king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Jehoash, 2 years before the earthquake." And already we have a ton of information, relatively speaking, about Amos. With Obadiah, we have nothing but a name, his name. With Joel, at least we had his father's name, but that was it. But here we have just a little bit of a biography. We know he was a shepherd. We know his hometown, Tekoa. We know when he was prophesying, which Joel and Obadiah, we have no idea when they were prophesying because it doesn't say. We have to kind of clue it in from what they said. But here Amos just tells us from the beginning. And really, we don't know if Amos wrote this down or somebody else did. It's the words of Amos that we have in this book. But we don't know that Amos actually penned them, but he delivered them. And we know when he did, in the days of Uzziah and Judah. So let's fill in our background slide to give us the overall information. Here is Amos, shepherd from Tekoa, and we know from a later passage in Amos chapter 7 that he was also a caretaker of sycamore trees. Now, we have just enough biography about Amos to make him a kind of folk hero, because we know his audience, even though he's from Tekoa, and we'll see in a minute that's in Judah, he was preaching to the northern tribes, the tribes of Israel, and particularly to the priests of Bethel. Again, from that same section of chapter 7, where we get a little bit of a biographical snippet about Amos, we see that he's at Bethel preaching. So this sort of legend of Amos as the kind of backwater, small town farmer who gets a calling from God to go preach to the corrupt northern tribes and goes to one of their primary places, Bethel, and preaches against the corruption of the system and preaching for the well-being of those who are downtrodden, rises up around Amos. A kind of Mr. Smith goes to Washington kind of thing. To use another biblical metaphor, the David versus Goliath sort of thing, where he's just one man, a simple man, an uneducated sort of rural man taking on the system to try to stand up for the poor and oppressed. And there's just enough information about Amos to make that viable, but we just don't know exactly how much of the legend is really true. So we know he was preaching during the reign of Jeroboam. We would call him Jeroboam the second if we were doing the naming, because he's the second king with the name Jeroboam of the northern tribes. The first Jeroboam was actually the founder of the northern tribes, the person who took the northern tribes away from the Davidic line and formed a separate nation. This is a descendant of his, actually not even a straight descendant of his, another king of the north, just using the same name. And we know from this section in chapter 7 that Amos just felt called by God. In Joel's case, there was a disastrous locust invasion that spurred Joel to write. In Obadiah, we know he was speaking out against the abuses of Edom against Israel. Amos just seems out of the blue to have felt he needed to speak against the corruption of the northern tribes, that God just moved him to act and to speak up. And there is Jeroboam and Uzziah and their reigns. They were both long reigns, unusual for that. In the days of those kings, lasting more than a few years was exceptional. So for Jeroboam and Uzziah to be there for 30 plus years is pretty exceptional. We don't know exactly when during the overlapping of their reigns Amos spoke, but most people assume it was towards the end of the reign. Yeah, we would think that line 2 years before the earthquake would be like a dead giveaway, so we could pinpoint it to a precise year. And some people have tried, but earthquakes are not uncommon in that part of the world, so it isn't possible to identify which exact tremor Amos is talking about when it says 2 years before the earthquake. So a timeline of the prophets we have already talked about. Amos seems to be the earliest, and we can date him pretty concretely around 760 BC. Obadiah was preaching after the fall of Jerusalem, but before the fall of Edom. And so we can also date that fairly precisely, almost 200 years later, at 560 BC, after the fall of Judah. And then Joel is up in the air. Like I said while we were studying him, he could have been before Amos. I think more likely he was after Nehemiah, which puts him after the exile is over and after Jerusalem has been rebuilt and things are functioning fairly normally in the city of Jerusalem, which puts him as late as 460 BC. We see these dates, and we see in the Bible where they just kind of follow one right after another. And I think we kind of clump them together as units. But if we overlapped our time frames and we thought about Joel, instead of preaching about the national disaster of locusts, as preaching about the national disaster of COVID in 2020, that would put Obadiah preaching back in the 1920s, during the age of flappers and the Great Gatsby and such. And that would put Amos as far back as 1720, when Colonial Williamsburg was just being founded, and our national heroes, George Washington and such, were either just being born or about to be born. So we're looking at a very early period time, and a time frame that separates these prophets by centuries.
Very good.
Now, to orient them in space as well as time, we see here a map of the Middle East. Jerusalem there in the middle. Tekoa is somewhat south of Jerusalem. Bethel is somewhat north of it. So Amos felt called while he was a shepherd / sycamore tree caretaker in Tekoa to go up to Bethel. Now, verse 2 is sometimes lumped in with the prophecies against the nations that make up the bulk of Amos chapter 1. But after reading some commentaries about it and thinking about this verse, I really believe Amos chapter 1, verse 2 serves as a kind of summary or succinct comment about everything that follows. It is kind of a opening epigraph for the book of Amos. And that would be Amos, and he said, Yahweh roars from Zion, and he utters his voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds wither, and the top of Carmel dries up. If that sounds vaguely familiar, it's because Joel used almost exact same wording towards the end of his book. Yahweh roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. He actually had Jerusalem and Zion in reverse order, but otherwise it's the same phrase from Joel. And since Joel is preaching, I think, much later than Amos, I'd say Joel is quoting him. But here's a picture. What animal do you think is being compared to Yahweh here?
Lion.
A lion. We have the lion, Yahweh, roaring from Zion. And there's just a hint of a weather image with utters his voice, because really utters his voice, the word for voice there, is often used of God's voice, and it is also the same common word for thunder. God's voice is assumed to be loud, roaring, ominous sound. And so the word for thunder is used for God's voice. So him uttering his voice from Jerusalem is him thundering from Jerusalem, roaring and thundering from Jerusalem. A couple of things I want to point out here is the emphasis on Zion and Jerusalem. I don't know if Amos actually used these words, or if this is, like I said, just a summary statement that was appended to Amos's words when the book was written. But it still shows absolute loyalty to the Yahweh of Jerusalem. Even though Amos was a prophet to the northern tribes, speaking to the 10 tribes of the north who had for a long time, by Amos's day, not had anything to do with Jerusalem, still, Amos is not going to back down from his loyalty to the Yahweh of the temple in Jerusalem. That is where he resides and from which he reigns. So it is it's loyalty to that, and Amos isn't going to back down to that, even if he's in the middle of the northern tribes. And notice this geographical contrast. He utters his voice from Jerusalem, and the top of Carmel dries up. Now, Mount Carmel is in the far north of Israel, the northern tribes of Israel. In fact, if you go any further north than Mount Carmel, you're really in Gentile territory of Tyre and Sidon and those other Gentile nations. So Mount Carmel is at the extreme northern side of the northern tribes of Israel. But Amos is saying, look, all God has to do is speak from Jerusalem, and Mount Carmel dries up. His voice reaches. If there's one theme that I think carries through all of Amos, it is that God's power and his authority transcend one nation, transcends just one place, but extends to all places. Mount Carmel is also one of the most fertile regions. It's Mount Carmel. We think of maybe a peak. Having been to Colorado, I often think of Pikes Peak when I think of high mountains. It's one of the tallest peaks, and there's definite mountain peak there. With Mount Carmel, it's more like a high ridge. So it's a high ridge. It's always got dew on it, and it rains plentifully there. It's a very fertile area of Israel in general and of the whole Middle East. And so when God is going to bring his judgment, all he has to do is speak, and Mount Carmel dries up. The most fertile region of the area becomes an arid wasteland if God is going to bring judgment against it. So two ways of God's power being shown. He has power over a large region, over all the earth, really, and he has power over nature. And we can take nothing for granted, because in God's hands, he can make it anything he wants. Now, the first chapter of Amos is going to address the first chapter of Amos and the first 3 verses of chapter 2 are going to address 6 of Israel and Judah's neighboring countries. And so I want to kind of give us an orientation of those, starting with the first one in Amos's list, which is Aram. He addresses Aram via its capital city, Damascus, there in the north. Notice that it's kind of the furthest away of all the nations from Israel, because it's on the other side of the Jordan River, the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and pretty far north. Most of Aram is north of where Israel is, but it has still been a serious adversary for Israel. It adjuts Gilead, which is technically part of Israel. It's heavily populated with Israelites, but Aram, as it is immediately adjacent to Gilead, often invades Gilead and often exerts its power and influence over that area because there's no real strong geographical break between Aram and Gilead. So the borders between them are very blurry anyway, and Aram often would invade that territory. So that's where they come in conflict the most, is with the territory of Gilead. The next nation to be preached against in Amos is Philistia. And Philistia is identified by its capital, Gaza. So Gaza is address that stands for Philistia. We're fairly familiar with a lot of the place names there because of the stories of David. David hung out sometimes with the Philistines when he was hiding out from Saul, often fighting against them. And so throughout Judges and throughout Kings, we see a lot of the Philistine, cities mentioned: Ekron, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, all of those right there next to Judah. They're mainly a problem for Judah, not the northern tribes of Israel, but they are still right there on the border of both. Next, Amos skips back north to Tyre. He addresses Tyre by its capital city, which is simply Tyre. There is no other real city up there but Tyre, but it's a very important city. It gets lengthy treatment in books like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, because it is the most powerful city of that region and very wealthy. Its wealth was legendary. It was built right there on a prominence out into the Mediterranean Sea. It had trade all over the Mediterranean with the early pre-Roman culture, with Greeks, with Egypt, with Israel. They were a very prominent trading hub throughout all of the Middle East at that time. And so he preaches out against Tyre. And then he talks to Edom. We're already fairly familiar with Edom because Edom came up with Obadiah. I mean, Obadiah is all about Edom. So we've already looked at Edom quite a bit. Bozrah and Teman get mentioned here in Amos as well. And so those are there with Edom, a little closer maybe than some of the others. Then he moves on to Ammon, right across the Jordan River, also on the other side of Gilead. Poor Gilead gets hit from the north from Aram, gets hit from the south by Ammon. Gilead gets it on both sides. But those are mostly Jews living in that area. Israelites, we would call them at this time, pre-exilic time. But they're the Israelites living in Gilead, and they're getting pressure from north and south from these other foreign countries. The capital of Ammon is Rabbah. And finally, in the first part of chapter 2, first 3 verses, Amos takes on Moab and the capital of Kerioth that's there. So these are the 6 countries that surround Israel and which Amos addresses in his first set of prophetic words, preaching in the book. Now, I'm not going to step through the details of every one of his 6 comments about the 6 nations. I wish I could. If I had 2 hours, I would definitely do that. But since I have only 15, 20 minutes before I want to try to wrap up, we're just going to delve in and kind of break apart the first of the sermonettes, if you will, against the 6 nations. We will break Damascus down and look at the details, mainly because it's one of the longest ones, so it has a lot of substance to it that we can look at, and 2, it establishes a pattern that Amos is going to follow with every single one of his comments. So we can look at the pattern here with Damascus, and then the rest of them pretty much follow the same pattern. It starts off with this turn of phrase, which he's going to repeat for every single one of the nations. Thus says Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of fill in the blank for the country, in this case, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment. That's little 3 transgressions or for 4 is a indication that what Damascus is guilty of, it's repeatedly been guilty of. It is a pattern of sin. And the word transgression there means that it's a violation of property, a violation of somebody else's property, and that you are abusing something that belongs to somebody else. Is this core meaning. It can sometimes be used of general sin, but the core meaning of the idea is that you're violating property. And so for these violations, these transgressions of Damascus, he is not going to revoke the punishment. Now, in English, we provided the punishment because in English, we need to hang this on something. But in Hebrew, it just says, I'm going to revoke it or turn it around. Or it could be revoke him or turn him around, because him, it's just a pronoun that could be either one. So I'm not going to revoke it. But it seems to be what he's talking about revoking or turning around is the consequence for those sins. He's not going to turn around the consequence, the punishment, what follows. They've earned it. And God isn't going to stop it from happening. What they've earned, they're going to get. They're going to get the consequence for the transgressions that they have made. He is not going to turn it around. And this, I highlighted Damascus here because this is Damascus's time, but you just replace Damascus with each of the nations or capital cities, and it's the same formula throughout chapter 1 and the first part of chapter 2. And so here's the actual reason. So what is the reason for the punishment? It's because they threshed Gilead with threshing sledges of iron. This is a threshing sledge. A piece of wood normally, although Amos says that they've been doing it with iron, but it's normally a piece of wood with little iron or metal bits underneath it. Maybe that's what he's referring to when he says the iron is the little bits underneath. But those have to be hard because they run this over wheat or whatever they've been gathering. They gather what they can just off the surface, but when they get all that they can with regular means, they go back with a threshing sledge and they run this over the wheat stalks that are left that they couldn't get easily, and it breaks them up into bits to make the wheat and the chaff easier to collect. So then you use your winnowing fork after you run the sledge over your wheat, and you winnow it in the air, and the chaff gets caught by the wind and blows out, and the wheat is heavier than the chaff, and it falls back to the ground right where you are. So you run over the wheat with the sledge, you break it into small bits, then you use your winnowing fork to get rid of the chaff, and you're left with wheat that you can then mill into food and flour or whatever. So this is a part of it. But basically it is what you do when you're trying to get every last little bit of wheat out of your crop. And this is what Amos says Damascus, Ammon is guilty of with Gilead. They're just not happy with what they normally would get from invading Gilead. They go back over it and get every last ounce of wealth, every last ounce of human life. They destroy it and they take what they want. And they don't just stop with a reasonable amount. They go beyond it. In a sense, this is the same kind of thing like Obadiah was talking about, how Edom would be destroyed to the point that they would leave nothing behind because they would just take everything. And here, using this sledge is a kind of similar metaphor for what Ammon has been doing to Gilead, taking it for all it's worth. Extreme measures, in other words. Interesting, this idea of threshing is used in a military context in 2 Kings, having to do with Ammon and Gilead. It says here in 2 Kings chapter 13, verses 3 through 4, and then verse 7, so the anger of Yahweh was kindled against Israel, and he gave them into the hand of Hazael, king of Aram, and into the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, repeatedly. Then Jehoahaz entreated Yahweh, and Yahweh listened to him, for he saw the oppression of Israel, because the king of Aram oppressed them. There was no army left over for Jehoahaz except 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 infantry, for the king of Aram had destroyed them and made them as the dust at threshing. So, again, this is kind of another situation like Obadiah with Edom and Israel. Israel had sinned against God, against Yahweh. Yahweh was upset with Israel for their disobedience, failure to be loyal to him. And so he allowed Aram to win and have victories over the Israelites as punishment for their failure to be loyal to him. But then the Aram invasions were oppressing. I get the sense, I don't know if you would, I get the sense that Aram is like overstepped their bounds. God was punishing Israel for their disloyalty, but Aram has been taking advantage of that beyond what even Yahweh would approve of. So when Jehoahaz cries out against Aram and for help from Yahweh, Yahweh is going to listen, because Aram has been misbehaving even in their own case. And here we have in Amos a kind of expression of that in Amos's sermon against Aram and their threshing sledges of iron. In each case, after the sermon against the nation, punishment is going to be meted out on that nation, and in every single case, fire is used as part of that description. And here it says, so I will send fire against Hazael's house, and it will consume the citadel fortress of Ben-Hadad. We just read about Hazael and Ben-Hadad in that section from 2 Kings. I quoted it partly for that connection, because these are historic kings of Aram who were problematic for Israel over and over again. But God is going to send fire to consume the citadel fortress of Ben-Hadad. We have a phrase that we sing in some of our praise choruses, and maybe it's ironic that it's in a praise chorus, but we speak about our God as a consuming fire. And this is one expression of that here. We see it in other cases where God's presence is like a fire that consumes, and Amos's context is one of them, where God's wrath is a consuming fire to destroy the enemies of Yahweh and the enemies of Yahweh's people, here the Israelites. One other theme that comes up, not as consistently as fire, but still comes up a few times in Amos's preaching, is the idea of going into exile. Remember, Amos is preaching long before the exile of either the north or the south. But he still has exile as a punishment coming from Yahweh. At the end of this sermon against Damascus, he says the people of Aram will go into exile to Kir. And don't ask me where Kir is. It's not on any map. We don't know exactly where Kir is supposed to be, but the people of Aram are going to go into exile there for what they've done. The idea is that God moves people around where he wants them, when he wants them there, and as punishment, he will take them out of the place they're comfortable and put them into a place where they are not comfortable, a place far from their own home. And so their punishment will be partly destruction and partly exile from their homeland to this other place where they are not at home. I guess it's ironic, perhaps, that what Amos says against Damascus and the Arameans is actually going to happen to Israel too. Almost exactly as he describes it. It will happen to Israel. But just because it's going to happen to Israel doesn't mean that it leaves Aram off the hook, because they're also guilty and they will also face punishment. So what do all these things say about God's wrath? I want to kind of generalize this that we see with Damascus, and which we will see repeated if you read through chapter 1 of Amos, see it repeated with every single one of these nations. Well, God's wrath isn't arbitrary, and it doesn't come out on your first offense. Repeated opportunities for repentance, repeated opportunities to turn around yourself and get things together have been refused. For every one of these nations, for 3 offenses of the nation and for 4. This isn't a first offense. This isn't something that God is going to pour out his wrath because you accidentally did something wrong or because you did something wrong once and are getting called on the carpet. These are recurring offenses. That's the implication, but for 3 and for 4 is that it isn't just a one-time thing, and it even isn't just what I mentioned. You're doing other things too. It's not just the one thing, not just the threshing sledges of iron that you're getting punished for, but a pattern of rebellion against God and of abuses against his people. This is a pattern of behavior, and God is going to punish it severely. It is also poured out to correct an unjust situation. God's wrath is not poured out just because you've done something he doesn't like. You've upset me. You've offended me by your behavior. I don't like what you're doing. It offends me personally, and therefore I'm going to pour my wrath out on you. That's not the case. I'm going to pour my wrath out on you because you are hurting people, because you are causing pain and suffering unduly. You are unjust. You are acting without justice in your behavior. I am going to bring justice to the situation by pouring wrath out on you. So God's wrath is justified, literally. It is bringing justice to an unjust situation. And finally, as we've seen, it is a consuming fire. God's wrath cannot be thwarted by our defenses. In almost every case with these sermons, Amos says that he is going to destroy their fortress strongholds, their most secure places in their cities. You'll see sometimes it even says, I'm going to destroy fortress strongholds, plural, inside a particular city. Because any given city, especially a large one, would have places inside of it that were extra secure, that were towers, or we might even call them bunkers. They were places where the leaders of the city and the wealthy would have safe houses, if you will, places inside a city. So if the outer defenses of the city were breached, those inner citadel fortresses could still be defended. Well, God says, I'm going to destroy those. I'm going to destroy your most secure places. It will be leveled. So you will not escape God's wrath. If you earn God's wrath, you are not escaping God's wrath. It will find you out wherever you are and will touch you. So what are these transgressions? I'm just going to list them. I don't have time to savor the nuances between each one of them, as I wish I did. So we're just going to summarize them. So we've already looked at Damascus. They threshed Gilead with threshing sledges of iron. We saw that that means more than just harvesting. In Gaza, which was the Philistines, remember, they exiled a whole community, handing them over to Edom. Notice that theme of exile again, but what scholars have decided this means when it talks about exiling a whole community and handing them over to Edom is participating in a slave trade of capturing Israelites and selling them to Edom in a slave exchange. For Tyre, they did not remember the covenant of brotherhood. This is, of all the ones, I wish I could go a little bit more into this with some more context. I'll just describe it verbally rather than showing all the scriptures. But when Solomon was king, right after David, he actually had a literal covenant with the king of Tyre, Hiram at the time, as a kind of trade agreement. So the covenant of brotherhood that's described here by Amos, it sort of describes the fact that Israel and Tyre actually were friendly with one another to the point of having a close covenant, and yet Tyre still abused Israelites at some point, and that covenant was broken. Edom, we know Edom and Israel had an unhappy relationship from our study in Obadiah. In Amos, he describes it this way: he pursued his brother with a sword, stifled his compassion, and his anger tore them apart continually, and he kept his rage forever. It's interesting, he talks about his brother with a sword. In Obadiah, we saw that Edom was personified as Esau, Jacob's brother, and the tangled relationship between Jacob and Esau becomes a foundation for describing the relationship between Israel and Edom, because Jacob and Esau and Israel and Edom have very similar rocky, tempestuous relationships. And here Amos says, unlike Esau and Jacob, who had a reconciliation after the death of their father, Edom and Israel as nations have never had that kind of reconciliation. There's never been any sense that they've been even trying to get back together and be on friendly terms. There is only the sword, only anger. It says he stifled his compassion. Like, even if he wanted to feel sorry for Israel, he held that back. He held back the feelings of compassion, and he let vent his rage. So it was definitely a bad relationship between Edom and Israel. With Ammon, remember, they're the ones to the south of Gilead. He says Ammon ripped open the pregnant women of Gilead in order to enlarge their territory. So as bad as Damascus has been with their threshing sledges of iron, Ammon seems to be even worse with their intentional targeting of women. As horrible as it is, it's not outside of what was commonplace then, which was to try to cut off the descendants of a people you're trying to take over because you don't want their children to have a sense of revenge and retaliate. But the picture that Amos paints of this action is just horrific. And so the people of Ammon are as bad or worse than Damascus. And then finally, with Moab, there's an interesting twist here, because Moab is called on the carpet for burning to lime the bones of the king of Edom. This seems like a very odd crime, because the king of Edom is already dead, whichever king that might have been. So it's, at worst, it's desecrating a corpse. What stands out to me, though, even beyond the oddity of the crime, is that the victim of this crime is whom? Who is the victim of this crime by Moab? It was Edom, not Israel and not Judah. It isn't the people that we would expect. The Moabites are being disrespectful, at least, to the people of Edom. Israel's enemy, Edom. The people who have been mistreating and insulting and pursuing with a sword God's people, Edomites, are the victim. And Moab is still guilty of a transgression before God for victimizing the Edomites. So not only is God's power greater than Israel, God's justice and God's reign and authority is greater than Israel, because he is concerned with other nations besides just his own. And he shows compassion even on the enemies of his own people when they are mistreated, when they are abused. He will punish Moab for mistreating Edom. So when in Scripture we read God is no respecter of persons, we can see that playing out even here in Amos, that God expects just and right behavior from all people and all nations, even against those who are his enemies. This, in a sense, is God himself loving his enemies and pouring out wrath on Moab for abusing Edom. Now, we are not nations. We are people, individuals. We don't really identify with that. If any individual person was to behave like these nations behaved, we would say they were psychopathic because of this kind of brutality and viciousness. Nations seem to get away with it. Individuals wouldn't. But I don't want us to walk away thinking that Amos's message isn't at all for us. God's wrath isn't just going to be poured out on nations. It's going to be poured out on individuals too when God comes in judgment. This is why we need a savior, because we really deserve as much wrath as any one of these nations do, because our behaviors are just as bad. Now, the next few points I'm going to make are me interpreting what we've just read from Amos and finding parallels with an individual life. When it came to Damascus and their threshing sledges of iron, basically just trying to get every little bit out of the Gilead without regard to who it hurt, I see just obstinance. They're just going to get what they want. They're going to plow ahead. I wanted to keep the agrarian metaphor. So they're going to plow ahead with the plans regardless of how it affects other people. Or when I do this, when I have a fixed idea and I'm going to go for it and I don't care what anybody else says or how anybody else feels about it, I want to get this done, then I could be like Damascus, just running over people with my threshing sledges of iron and getting stuff that I want out of this without consideration for others. Or greed, as the Philistines were selling people for money as slaves. If I just use other people to get what I want, I'm really no better than the Philistines using people instead of loving people and using things. I'm loving things and using people, to use a cliche. But if I'm just seeing people as a means to an end, I'm really not any better than the Philistines. Or if I'm faithless, if I break commitments when they're no longer convenient or beneficial to me, like Tyre, who had a commitment with Israel, but when it wasn't convenient anymore, when they weren't getting enough out of it, they just broke that commitment and went their own way and then started abusing Israel. Then if I'm being faithless to somebody, I am no better than Tyre, and I deserve wrath from God. If I'm holding on to resentment, if I hold grudges against my family and friends, if I treat them with animosity, even hostility, and I'm not seeking reconciliation, and I just always want to build barriers and not build bridges and try to reconcile, then I'm really no better than Edom and the way he treated Israel. If I'm just callous about other people's feelings, if I just don't care who gets hurt or what happens to them as long as I get my way, then I'm as bad as the Ammonites, just ripping people to shreds. Or disrespect, as Moab showed to the Edomites. If I just am looking for ways to show people how I'm superior to them, if I'm showing them disrespect, then I'm no better than Moab. We think of the crimes of these nations and how horrible they were, and sure, they deserve God's wrath for all the horrible crimes they do. But the fact is, we all deserve it. And the fact is, one person already took the wrath that belongs on us. Jesus, in his sacrifice, is our Savior, literally saving us from the wrath of God. because we have acted in ways that fully deserve that wrath to be poured out on us, and nobody could stand against it. And Jesus didn't stand against it. He took it on himself and died in our place and accepted that wrath for us. And so that's why our loyalty and our allegiance is due totally to Jesus.